The boy hadn't spoken in 3 years, and not since the accident that took his parents and left him with scars no one could see. The mountains of northern Montana rose around him like ancient guardians, their peaks dusted with early snow even in late September. Daniel lived with his grandfather now, in a cabin tucked against the forest edge where silence was more common than conversation. He was 12 years old, but his eyes carried the weight of someone much older, someone who had learned that words could disappear when the world became too heavy to describe. His grandfather, a retired forest ranger named Samuel, understood the quiet. He never pushed Daniel to speak, never filled the space between them with unnecessary noise. They communicated through gestures, through the rhythm of shared tasks, through the language of presence that needed no sound. Each morning, they walked the trails together, Samuel pointing out animal tracks, teaching Daniel to read the forest the way others read books. Daniel absorbed everything with silent attention, his gaze sharp and observant, but his voice remained locked away somewhere deep inside, buried beneath grief he couldn't name. The morning it happened, fog clung to the valley floor like a living thing, thick and gray and cold. Daniel walked alone that day, his grandfather tending to repairs at the cabin. He moved through the mist with practiced ease, his boots soft against the damp earth, his breath forming small clouds in the autumn air. The forest felt different somehow, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. Birds were quieter than usual, their calls muted and distant. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then he heard it. Not a sound exactly, but something that reached him beneath the fog, a feeling that pulled at his attention like a thread tugging at fabric. He stopped walking, his heart suddenly loud in his chest. The feeling came again, stronger this time, the presence nearby that radiated distress so palpable it made his skin prickle. He turned toward it instinctively, moving off the trail and into the dense undergrowth. What he found made him freeze completely. A wolf cub, no more than 8 weeks old, lay tangled in old barbed wire hidden beneath fallen leaves. The wire had wrapped around its hind leg, cutting into the fur, holding it captive against the base of a rotting stump. The cub was exhausted, its sides heaving with shallow breaths, its golden eyes wide with pain and fear. When it saw Daniel, it didn't growl or snap. It simply stared at him with an intensity that felt like a question, like a plea shaped from desperation rather than sound. Daniel's first instinct was to run, to find his grandfather, to let someone else handle this impossible situation. But the cub's eyes held him there, and something in that gaze felt familiar. It was the look of someone trapped, someone who had been alone too long, someone who couldn't ask for help even when they needed it most. He recognized it because he had seen it in his own reflection every day for 3 years. He knelt slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. The cub tensed but didn't try to escape. Its body trembled, whether from cold or fear or exhaustion, Daniel couldn't tell. He reached toward the wire, his hands steady despite the hammering of his heart. The cub watched him, its breathing quick and shallow, its muscles coiled with the instinct to flee. But it didn't move. It waited, as if somehow understanding that this silent boy was trying to help. The wire was old and rusted, biting deep into the cub's leg. Daniel worked carefully, his fingers gentle as he tried to loosen the twisted metal. The cub whimpered once, a soft, broken sound that cut through the fog like a blade. Daniel paused, meeting those golden eyes again, and something passed between them in that moment. A recognition. A shared understanding of what it meant to hurt without being able to explain it. It took nearly 20 minutes to free the leg, each movement slow and precise. When the last loop of wire finally fell away, the cub didn't bolt. It simply lay there, exhausted, its injured leg held gingerly off the ground. Blood matted the fur where the wire had cut deepest. Daniel pulled off his jacket without thinking and wrapped it around the small, trembling body. The cub leaned into the warmth, its eyes closing briefly, trusting in a way that defied every wild instinct it should have had. Daniel lifted the cub carefully, feeling its heart racing against his chest. It was lighter than he expected, fragile in a way that made him afraid he might break it just by holding on. He turned back toward the cabin, moving as quickly as he dared through the fog-shrouded forest. The cub stayed still in his arms, its breathing gradually slowing, its body relaxing into the steady rhythm of Daniel's steps. Samuel was on the porch when Daniel emerged from the tree line, and the old man's expression shifted from surprise to immediate action. He didn't ask questions, didn't waste time with words. He simply cleared the kitchen table, gathered supplies, and began tending to the cab's wounded leg with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime caring for injured animals. Daniel stood nearby, watching every movement, his hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline and something else he couldn't name. The cab lay still throughout the cleaning and bandaging, occasionally lifting its head to look at Daniel as if checking that he was still there. When Samuel finished, he carried the cab to a large wooden crate lined with soft blankets near the fireplace. The warmth from the flames filled the space with golden light, and the cab curled into the blankets with a soft sigh that sounded almost like relief. Samuel finally spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "This little one's been separated from its pack. Too young to survive alone out there, especially with that leg. We'll need to contact wildlife services in the morning." He paused, studying Daniel's face. "But for tonight, we'll keep it warm and safe." Daniel nodded, unable to look away from the cab. It was watching him again, those golden eyes reflecting the firelight, holding an intelligence that seemed far too old for such a young creature. He sat down on the floor beside the crate, close enough to offer presence without crowding. The cab shifted, stretching one small paw toward him through the gaps in the wooden slats. Daniel hesitated, then reached out, letting his fingers brush against the soft fur. The cab didn't pull away. Instead, it pressed its paw more firmly against his hand, as if anchoring itself to this quiet connection. That night, Daniel didn't sleep in his room. He stayed on the floor beside the crate, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the cab's breathing settle into a peaceful rhythm. Every so often, the cab would whimper softly in its sleep, and Daniel would whisper without sound, shaping words with his breath that never quite formed, trying to offer comfort in the only way he knew how. The fire crackled and popped, filling the silence with warmth, and for the first time in 3 years, Daniel felt something shift inside him. A loosening. A small crack in the wall he had built around his voice. The next morning brought unexpected complications. When Samuel contacted Wildlife Services, they explained that the nearest rehabilitation facility was overwhelmed with injured animals from recent wildfires. They could take the cab, but it would be weeks before they had space, and the young wolf's chances of survival in their overcrowded conditions were uncertain. The alternative was to care for it temporarily at the cabin, under their guidance, until a better placement could be arranged. Samuel looked at Daniel, reading the silent plea in his grandson's eyes. "We'll keep it here," he said into the phone. "We'll follow your protocols." Over the following days, a routine emerged. Daniel took on the primary care of the cab, whom he had silently named Echo, though he never spoke the name aloud. He prepared the special formula Wildlife Services had provided, fed Echo with careful patience, changed the bandages on the healing leg, and spent hours simply sitting beside the crate, offering the steady presence that seemed to calm the young wolf more than anything else. Echo grew stronger quickly, his natural resilience shining through despite his rough start. Within a week, he was moving around the crate with increasing confidence, his injured leg bearing weight more easily each day. He watched Daniel constantly, tracking his movements with intense focus, responding to his presence with a trust that deepened with each passing hour. What surprised everyone, including the wildlife specialists who checked in regularly, was how Echo responded specifically to Daniel's silence. When Samuel moved through the cabin, Echo would watch with mild interest but remain in his crate. When Daniel approached, Echo would immediately perk up, his tail wagging softly, his entire body orienting toward the boy as if drawn by an invisible thread. It was as though the cab recognized something in Daniel's quietness, found comfort in the absence of overwhelming noise and sudden sounds. One afternoon, in nearly 2 weeks after the rescue, Daniel sat reading beside Echo's crate when the cab began to whine softly. It wasn't the sound of pain or fear, but something else, something that felt like loneliness. Daniel looked up, meeting those golden eyes, and felt an ache bloom in his chest. He understood that feeling. He had carried it every day since losing his parents, that hollow sense of being separate from the world, unable to bridge the gap between himself and everyone else. Without thinking, he opened the crate door. Echo stepped out cautiously, testing his weight on the healing leg, then moved directly to Daniel's side. He pressed his small body against the boy's leg, leaning into him with complete trust. Daniel reached down slowly, running his fingers through the thick fur, feeling the warmth and the steady heartbeat beneath. Echo tilted his head back, looking up at Daniel with an expression that seemed almost human in its depth of feeling. Something broke open inside Daniel then. A dam he hadn't known he was holding back. His chest tightened, his eyes burned, and for the first time since the accident, tears came. They fell silently, tracking down his cheeks, carrying 3 years of grief and isolation and pain he had never been able to release. Echo didn't move away. Instead, the cub pressed closer, offering the only comfort he could, the simple act of being present without needing words to explain why it mattered. Samuel found them like that an hour later, boy and wolf curled together on the floor, both sleeping peacefully in a patch of afternoon sunlight. The old man stood in the doorway, his own eyes bright with emotion he didn't try to hide. He had watched his grandson disappear into silence, had respected the space Daniel needed to grieve, but had worried endlessly about whether the boy would ever find his way back. Seeing him now, holding this wild creature with such gentle care, Samuel felt the first real spark of hope in 3 years. The bond between Daniel and Echo deepened over the following weeks. They became inseparable, moving through the cabin and the surrounding forest like two parts of a whole. Echo followed Daniel everywhere, his steps growing steadier and more confident as his leg healed completely. Daniel taught him to navigate the trails, to recognize safe spaces and potential dangers, to understand the rhythms of the forest that would one day be his home again. What amazed Samuel most was how they communicated. Daniel never spoke, but Echo seemed to understand him perfectly. A gesture, a look, the shift in posture, all of it formed a language between them that transcended words. When Daniel wanted Echo to stay close, he would simply touch his chest, and the cub would immediately move to his side. When it was time to rest, Daniel would settle on the ground, and Echo would curl against him without hesitation. They had created their own way of being together, built on presence and patience and the deep understanding that sometimes silence speaks louder than any sound. The wildlife specialists visited regularly, monitoring Echo's progress and preparing for the eventual transition to a rehabilitation facility. Each visit brought the same observation. The cub was thriving physically, his leg completely healed, his body strong and healthy. But emotionally, he had bonded to Daniel in a way that complicated the standard protocols. Separating them would cause stress for both, yet keeping a wild animal wasn't a viable long-term solution. Samuel and Daniel knew the day was coming when Echo would have to leave. They didn't discuss it, but the knowledge hung between them like morning fog, present and unavoidable. Daniel spent every possible moment with Echo, as if trying to memorize every detail, every soft sound, every warm press of fur against his hand. The cub seemed to sense the approaching change, becoming more clingy, following Daniel even more closely than before. Then one morning, Daniel woke to find Echo standing at the cabin door, staring out at the forest with an intensity that made the boy's heart sink. The cub's posture had shifted, his ears forward, his body tense with an awareness that hadn't been there before. When Daniel approached, Echo looked back at him with eyes that held a new wildness, a pull toward something beyond the safety of the cabin. Samuel saw it too. "He's hearing his pack," the old man said quietly. "They are calling him home." That night, they left the cabin door open. Echo paced between the threshold and Daniel's side, torn between two worlds. Daniel sat on the porch steps, watching the cub struggle with the decision, feeling his own heart break with every conflicted movement. He wanted to keep Echo safe, he wanted to hold on to this connection that had given him a reason to feel again. But he also understood what it meant to be trapped, to be held back from where you belonged. As midnight approached, Echo made his choice. He walked to Daniel one last time, pressing his head against the boy's chest in a gesture that felt like goodbye. Daniel wrapped his arms around the cub, holding him close, feeling tears slip down his cheeks again. And then, for the first time in 3 years, words rose in his throat. Not many, just two, shaped carefully and released into the night air like a prayer. "Be safe." His voice was rough from disuse, barely more than a whisper, but it was real. The sound of it shocked him, the vibration in his throat unfamiliar and strange. Echo pulled back, looking at him with those golden eyes, and for a moment, Daniel could have sworn the cub understood. Then Echo turned and ran into the darkness, disappearing into the forest with the silent grace of a creature returning to where he belonged. Daniel stayed on the porch, his grandfather's hand warm on his shoulder, watching the tree line long after the cab vanished. The forest felt emptier now, the silence heavier, but something had changed inside him. The wall around his voice had cracked, and though it would take time to break it down completely, he had finally taken the first step. Over the following months, Daniel spoke more. Slowly at first, single words and short phrases, then gradually longer sentences as his confidence grew. He talked to his grandfather about his parents, about the accident, about the 3 years of silence that had felt like drowning. Samuel listened with patient understanding, never pushing, always present. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind carried sounds from the deep forest, Daniel would hear a distant howl. It might have been Echo, or it might have been any of the wild wolves that roamed those mountains. But Daniel chose to believe it was his friend, calling out to let him know he was alive, he was strong, he was home. The silent boy who found a wolf cub in the fog learned that healing doesn't follow a straight path. It comes in unexpected moments, through unlikely connections, through the simple act of caring for something beyond yourself. Echo had given him a reason to feel again, and in return, Daniel had given the cub a chance to survive. Their bond wasn't built on words. It was built on presence, on the quiet understanding that sometimes the most profound connections happen in silence. And when Daniel finally found his voice again, it carried the strength of everything he had learned during those wordless weeks with a wild creature who had needed him as much as he needed it. The mountains still rose around the cabin, ancient and unchanging. But the boy who walked those trails now moved differently, spoke softly to the forest, and carried in his heart the memory of golden eyes that had seen him when he couldn't see himself. Echo had returned to the wild, but he left behind something precious. The understanding that even in our deepest silence, we are never truly alone, and sometimes the smallest voice can echo loud enough to bring us back to life.